Ever since the early 1950s, an enormous reservoir has dominated almost all of western Massachusetts, taking up close to 39 square miles of the Pioneer Valley. The reservoir is the main water supply for almost 2.5 million people in the state of Massachusetts, including 40 communities in the greater Boston area. Quabbin is much more than just a water supply for our state's largest city. It's a recreational playground filled with colorful vegetation and vast variety of wildlife, including moose, deer, and bald eagles.
You've got the combination of beautiful scenery, water supply that's probably the largest untreated, unfiltered water supply in New England.
A lot of people have no idea what's right here in their backyard.
In the late 1800s, the city of Boston and other communities were in need of a new source of water.
So the Board of Health in Boston decided they needed water, more water, so they looked out here, they found the valley.
They had surveyors come in as early as 1895 because Boston had its westward expansion, constantly looking for new sources of water as the city grew, and did all sorts of reports for feasibilities for water supply, and they made it out to the Swift River.
The only problem was there were 2,400 people that lived in the valley. There were 35 cemeteries. There were 7,400 people that were buried.
At the time, the Swift River Valley was occupied by 4 towns: Prescott, Dana, Enfield, and Greenwich. It took several years to pass the bill to create the reservoir, and finally, in 1927, the Swift River Act was passed.
They surveyed the valley and they noticed that there was 2 gaps in the hills, which was perfect to impound the Swift River on this side, on the Windsor Dam side, and on the Goodnoe Dike side, there was a brook called Beaver Brook that went through there, which they dammed that up too. But the hills were situated, made an ideal spot for a reservoir.
Swift River Act was passed, and everybody got word that they were going to have to sell their land to the state of Massachusetts for fair market value. If they owned a business, they weren't going to be paid for the loss of business. It was just land and the buildings.
They would get a letter from the state, and they would tell them that they had X amount of days to make some type of a decision to move. The people back in those days, they thought they were sacrificing something for the greater good of Boston. That doesn't mean they agreed with it or liked it, but they just more or less stoically accepted what they had to do for the most part.
On April 27, 1938, Enfield held a farewell ball in honor of the 4 towns that were being disbanded that night.
At the stroke of midnight, they sang Auld Lang Syne, and there was a lot of crying because that's when the official state proclamation that the 4 towns were discontinued at midnight, April 27th. So after 1201, legally the 4 towns didn't exist.
The transition to fill the reservoir began. It took 6 years to accomplish this feat. The reservoir was officially ready for distribution in June of 1946.
When the reservoir is full, it holds 412 billion gallons of water, as you can see behind me. When the reservoir is full to capacity, the way the engineers have set it up, the top of the water is 530 feet above sea level. And the water flows through a large tunnel, 24 miles east to Wachusett Reservoir, which is northeast of Worcester. And then from Worcester, it flows to the communities in Boston.
The Quabbin, however, is much more than a reservoir. It's a breeding ground for all types of wildlife that dominate the Pioneer Valley. Quabbin is known for having the highest bald eagle population in Massachusetts, but it hasn't always been that way.
In the late 1970s, the Division of Fish and Wildlife decided they would try and reinstate the bald eagle into Massachusetts as a nesting species. They used a process called hacking, by which they would take young bald eagles from a nest up in Canada and they'd put them up in a cage structure 30 feet up, and they were taken care of until they were old enough to fly, and then they would release them into the wild. So it was hoped that when these birds were old enough to mate, they would come back to the Quabbin, and that's exactly what happened.
The bald eagles were released in 1982, and over a 7-year span rose to an incredible amount of 42 eagles. Bald eagles aren't the only species that has seen their numbers grow in Quabbin. The white-tailed deer have been a constant problem around the reservoir because of the overpopulation, forcing the managers to start up an annual deer hunt.
The reason they had the deer hunt was to get rid of the overcrowding because they were overbrowsing the undergrowth. The woods you could see in quite far, which was great when you wanted to go look for cellar holes and hole sites.
A healthy deer population is 12 to 15 deer per square mile. In the 70s, they had close to 35 or 40 deer per square mile, and it was building and building. It was decided that in 1991 they would have a deer hunt. The deer populations are down to where it should be. The forest regeneration is all coming back, and the deer hunt today is in what they call maintenance mode. I hear moose are expanding their range. When I first started working here, a moose was very, very rare to see a moose, and now people see moose here on a daily occasion. An adult moose has to eat 50 pounds a day of grasses and bark, and they're causing a lot of damage.
Quabbin isn't entirely accessible, however. There are certain things you can't do and certain places you can't go in and around the reservoir.
Prescott Peninsula comes to mind because there's a lot of research that's going on the Prescott Peninsula. Since 9/11, some of the areas have been put off limits that you used to hike on. They don't allow cross-country skiing because people tend to get down in really far on skis.
The only passive thing that they allow is hiking and snowshoeing and some bicycling on the hard-top roads.
Overall, the Quabbin is a great place to see wildlife and do recreational activities. With a rich history and a great purpose, Quabbin will forever be an important part of surrounding communities that reach all the way out to Boston.
To me, like I said, the spiritual aspect of it is that generations of people lived here, built their lives, their homes, their livelihoods at good times and hard times. You can look out there, and unless you look for the details, you wouldn't even know that it ever happened. I think that speaks volumes about human life in general. It's you're here now and you're in the present, but 50 or 100 years from now, nobody's going to know you're here.